Hello, listeners. Welcome to the fourth episode of the Unlocking the Energy Trilemma podcast with our hosts Ravi, Krishnan, and Jose A. Martinez, Jam. Today, Ravi and Jam speak with Maximo Miccinilli, a public affairs and communications expert, about the new carbon border adjustment mechanism. Maximo is Senior Vice President and Head of Energy and Climate at Fleischmann Hillard EU. Previously, he led SER's think tank energy and climate research team. He worked for the Italian government and the European Commission, among other roles. Ravi, Jam, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ava, and welcome, Maximo. We are very happy to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. Thank you, Jose and Ravi. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, Maximo, for joining us. Yep.
Today, it's a hot topic. We want to speak about CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It's not an easy topic, so we'll try to make a nice conversation about this and go into the topic. And why don't you start giving us your favorite figure about this concept?
There are many, Jose, to be honest, but the one I like the most is the expectation that the European Commission has in terms of the revenues that this mechanism can get. So they are saying that CBAM will create around 9.1 billion euros per year from now to 2030, which is pretty significant, and we don't talk too much about it.
For a lot of our audience, Maximo is from the United States as well. And just for the purpose of many of our viewers, could you discuss the purpose of CBAM introduced by the European Union?
Yeah, sure, Ravi. CBAM is not such a recent idea. It all started mid-2010s. There were some academic discussions by which Europe will need to have a sort of taxation on the borders if we want to deal with carbon leakage, in particular for heavy sectors, because as we have a carbon pricing system, not all the countries have a carbon pricing system, and the industry needs to pay for every ton of CO2. And at some point, we said if we will continue to tighten this emission trading system, the ETS as we call it, there will be a moment where companies either they will not be able to compete and move away carbon leakage, or there will be a massive exports of products to the EU with lower CO2 standards. So the idea was during the Green Deal 2019 with President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, she said, I want to make sure that steel, aluminum, fertilizers, energy-intensive sectors in general, also cement, will have a tool by which we will create a level playing field for those countries that do not have a carbon pricing mechanism. So we impose a tax on the border with the difference of the CO2 you are not paying from the import country, and we make sure then that companies operating in the European Union will be able to compete because you will equal the CO2 price to countries that don't have that system. So that was the, let's say, the theoretical starting point. And the Commission developed this policy and adopted for the first time in history this carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is linked to the CO2 price of the ETS. So basically, ETS will feature a price. Today is 70 something, let's say 75. So you will assess the production of the importer country, and you will ask the importer to report on the emissions from this country and pay the difference of CO2 before the product gets into Europe.
So in other words, you're saying by charging an extra for the CO2 emissions of their products sold within the EU, the CBAM basically aims to level the playing field for domestic producers while incentivizing global companies to adopt more sustainable practices. Is that an accurate statement?
Exactly, Ravi. I think CBAM is not just a mechanism to ensure sustainable production in Europe linked to paying CO2 pricing. It's also about, I would call it climate diplomacy, because you want other countries to introduce similar mechanisms. Some countries, similar ETS systems. In Canada, for instance, China now is trying to introduce one, or carbon taxation, CO2 tax, and make sure that we start promoting trade under the same environmental standards. Because if we have a world where some countries oblige companies to pay CO2 and some others not, you will have a lot of tensions, from trade related tensions, but also a lot of unfair practices. So that is creating a lot of uncertainties and frustration, because not all countries are ready to go into a carbon pricing system.
And we are in the age of the cloud, we are in the age of blockchain, but one of the problems of CBAM seems to be the traceability, not only of physical goods, but even we were talking about electricity. It seems very difficult to trace electrons. So what do you think about the traceability and where we are?
Yeah, you're spot on, Jose. When we were discussing with the Commission about the design of this system, it was all about how we make sure that we calculate emissions for every single product, including electricity, which is part of the scope one, and make sure that the importer will be ready to pay fair, fair tax. It's important also for those entering. But at the same time, how do you make sure that it's credible and it's regularly updated? Because you cannot assume that, let's say, big reason why we introduced electricity into CBAM was because, for instance, Spain was concerned that Morocco will export a lot of electricity made out of coal. Okay, that's a potential issue. Or at the time before the war in Ukraine and Russia, that Ukraine will export hydrogen made out of nuclear. So the thing is that CBAM will need to adapt in terms of how to calculate those emissions. And we will need to have certifiers and a very solid governance to make sure that we won't be unfair with countries. But you talk about electricity, but it's even difficult with metals. So imagine for electrons. When it comes to metals, you think about aluminium. Let's pick aluminium. You have direct emissions that you can certainly create some default values based on some international standards organizations. But what about indirect emissions? So scope 2 is much more difficult. If you look at the numbers and you introduce in CBAM scope 2, which is under discussion, by the way, you might need to make a lot of assumptions, because you need to go to the sites to see exactly how a company in Russia and China are producing aluminum. It's a bit of an intrusive system, I would say, but it will require a lot of recalibration as we move from the transitional period, which will end by 2025, end of 2025.
Mhm.
And based on all that data, we will need to make sure that the moment we start with imposing that taxation to importers, there will not be any doubt about the scope 1 and 2, because otherwise we will have countries going to WTO filing complaints, and that might
So,
happen in any case.
right. So, in the same vein, there, what was the international response to the CBAM by countries like Brazil, China, India, South Africa, and also North American countries like Canada and US? Do you have a view or perspective on that?
Yes, thanks, Ravi. It's a very good question, because we were saying CBAM, it's a reflection also of climate diplomacy. That was the way the European Union put it politically. So I say we as European, we went to COP, last COP in Dubai. And the first day, President Lula from Brazil said, I want CBAM to be part of the agenda of COP 28,
Right.
because I think it's not fair. It's using environment to protect the European market. And some African countries wanted to join that call, but after a couple of discussions, they say, okay, we have a lot of things to be discussed at COP28. We won't do it. And it dropped the agenda. But we see countries like China saying we are monitoring very closely if the design and the calculation of embedded emissions, which is very difficult because it depends for plant per plant, will be an acceptable, decent, transparent system. I have to say, Ravi, that China is really trying to create its own system. And the big question for them will be how to discount a very high price in Europe, let's say 70, maybe might go up to 100 by 2026. And a price that in China, the signal is, let's say, $10, $15. Are we going to discount that? How are we going to do that? Not clear. It's part of legislation, but it's not clear. The second thing I would say is that the closest European allies, like the US, we know that it doesn't matter. You have a Republicans, Democrats leading the White House in 2025. They won't go for a federal ETS system. It will stay state position, like California having one, like New York. So it means that we will need to find ways to create some sort of cooperation between countries that cannot go into that direction, but they can create equivalent measures to impose a price to CO2, which I think is very delicate. But I'm pretty optimistic in the sense that I don't think Europe will step back. I think this is very anchored into the Green Deal. I think there will be a lot of negotiations from now to mid-2025, because there is also the intention to create an export regime within CBAM, which will create further issues at WTO. And as trade needs trade rules, international rules, WTO needs a total reform, because with or without CBAM, we need to start integrating voluntary carbon markets, mandatory carbon markets, carbon taxation regimes. Just take Chile, and I stop there. Chile is looking into an ETS starting from a carbon tax today. They want to combine both. If Chile wants to export copper to the EU, how the European Union will count the carbon tax, existing one, and the new ETS?
Just in that same light of argument there, what is the timeline? Is there a timeline established for those producers around the world who are impacted by this, whether you're a cement plant or a steel producer, or whether you're a power plant exporting into the EU? What is the timeline in terms of when the CBAM would be in force?
The transitional phase, it's a reporting phase that started last year and will end the last day of 2025. All the importers, all the companies that are importing aluminum, steel, fertilizers, electricity, that cement, they have to register as soon as possible into the CBAM digital platform. And this is an obligation. It doesn't mean they will pay any taxes, but it means that the Commission will assess the data and the potential impacts before the definitive and final phase will kick off 1st of January 2026. So this is very important for all hearing. You need to get into this. There are plenty of information online in the European Commission website. You need to do your homework. If you have issues with data, there are people at national level that can help you if you are importing from Italy, Spain, Poland. The second deadline is the Commission will come up with the reports by mid-2025 to assess state of play, potential issues with international partners, and the data that is missing or will be added to the final phase. And that will be crucial to monitor that, because 6 months later, the Commission will inaugurate the final phase in 1st of January 2026, whereby all the importers will need to report and be ready to get the CBAM certificates that will cost the money depending on this calculation of where you're importing and the CO2 price. There will be CO2 price in Europe will be linked to the system. There will be a website showing the price. And based on that, you will need at some point during 2026 to release your certifications, and that will mean you will need to factor in the cost of your inputs. We do expect some companies already working on how to diversify the imports if they see that could be costly. So that's an important exercise to be done now. And then making sure that you have the right contacts at national level, because the national authorities will appoint people to work on this. So there will be specialized people in each member state. So it's important your company is ready to meet and to be in touch with those national competent authorities.
But Maximo, let me ask you probably a silly question. Who's gonna pay for this? Because if in France, in some moment, there is not enough electricity and we have to import offshore electricity from the UK, on December 25, it will have a cost, and in January 26, it will be a higher cost with the taxes. So at the end, the European citizens will pay more for the same electricity if they need it, and in the same way for the LNG from the States or from metals from Latin America or whatever. So who's going to pay for this? Is the European citizens?
I like the provocation because it's a question that are very close to the political mindset and say, okay, now we are reporting, but what's going to happen the moment Europe has €100 per ton of CO2 and you are importing copper from Chile, let's say, and you need to pay 60% of that price? I think overall, the companies importing in Europe will need to absorb part of that because there is an administrative cost. You really need to work on how to deal with CBAM. That's an important cost. Let's not forget that. And then is how they will pass the cost to their customers. Because there are some that they will be absorbed by the customers in the supply chain. But there will be others that if the price is too high, the end customer, let's say importing aluminum from Brazil and using it for cars or batteries, it will create a cost that will create issues for consumers. So I do expect companies to try to circumvent CBAM.
Mhm.
And that's a big problem of CBAM, of the design of CBAM. What happens if some imports will go through countries that have an ETS system? If an American company go export part of the material to Canadian, or in a state in the United States without ETS, export that internally to California, and from California it's exported to the EU, they will pay less. So circumvention, it's a big loophole of this legislation. And I think your answer has to do with that. Is if you circumvent, so CBAM will not work and the customer will not feel it. But if you apply to CBAM a very high CO2 price for materials that part of the clean tech, the future of industry, customers, citizens, households will need to pay that plus. And maybe politicians will need to explain that it's part of being more sustainable and be greener.
Yeah.
But can happen.
So one of the objectives, if I understand this right, one of the objectives of CBAM is to reduce CO2 emissions from industries by, I believe, 55% by 2030, from 1990 levels, if I'm not mistaken. So if that is the case, I would imagine that a bulk of these reductions, even for domestic industry within the EU, will have to come from reduction of scope 1 emissions. And that would also be the case for someone in North America who is exporting to the EU. The biggest impact for that affected party would come by reducing the scope 1 emissions, which is largely what is your local electric utility doing that if you're purchasing power from a local company, correct? So do you believe that the technology is available in a cost-effective manner to meet that level of reduction that can be incorporated by a utility, or if they're co-generating at their site, there is technology available, whether you're going to capture the carbon and sequester it, or whether you're going to burn hydrogen, or whether you're going to use some other strategy to reduce your emission footprint. Do you believe that there is technology available there to make it happen?
It's really a very good question, because you cannot dissociate CBAM from the willingness of Europe to reindustrialize the continent, but at the same time reducing Scope 1 from heavy industries. And my short answer is, I don't think we have the policies and the regulations on top of CBAM to ensure access to the right levels of capex for key industries with materials that are materials of the future: copper, nickel, aluminum, steel, where they can invest and secure 2030, 2040 production and competitive production. You mentioned CCS. It's becoming too expensive. It's just too expensive. We really need much more financial support. And the only project I get to my mind is in Norway, where the Norwegian state is putting so much money to the risk capex on CCS. The other big opportunity that the Commission put there was hydrogen. And hydrogen, if you take the chemical sector, they will be happy to have more hydrogen, but there is no infrastructure to connect with these sites. And then the electrification pathway, which is the natural pathway when you can do more electrification, means more renewables, more PPAs in the right time to reduce as much as possible your emissions. Because having CBAM is not for free, Ravi. The deal with CBAM is that you will get a regular, gradual reduction of your free allowances under ETS. So you get less free allowances over time from 26 to 2034, when you get zero. And just to recall people, free allowances are given under the ETS to the industries to avoid carbon leakage. The political deal, regulatory deal, was that you get less of these allowances, but you get protection of CBAM as a more cost efficient measure. But does it mean that they will give you enough financial capabilities as steel, cement, aluminum, fertilizers to invest in efficiencies, to invest in CCS, to invest in renewables, self-generation? My answer is no. My answer is that CBAM and ETS together will not give you financial capabilities to be competitive from now to beginning of 2030. And that's the big concern of the industry. CBAM can be small shield, but it won't necessarily reduce your emissions or give you the financial means to reduce emissions to reach the climate goals that the EU has set by 2030.
Maximo, it is a great conversation. I think we have a key milestone just in 1.5 years with CBAM, and at the same time, we have all the stuff with the energy transition. We are here in the pot of unlocking the energy trilemma. So as a final recommendation, if you had a magic wand and you could do something to unlock the energy trilemma, what would you do with CBAM or related to CBAM to unlock it?
Thank you so much. I have enjoyed. And the last question is perhaps the most difficult one. I think the trilemma is still there, and we're moving to one side to another. Energy security is back because of geopolitical tensions in the world. I'm not a magician, but I like to connect it with CBAM, because CBAM, from a design and from the expected result as a policy, as a tool, is trying to combine the two big contenders of the last 15 years, which is industries needs to be competitive, but industries needs to be the champions of decarbonizing, because they have the big demand of electricity, other fuels. And if they decarbonize, it's a good sign that we are fixing this trilemma. And I think that my hint to policymakers, to intellectual circles, think tanks, associations, young people, academics, is we need more thinking about policies that look at these two. And that means we have to be courageous and take risks from a policy perspective. They won't be perfect. It will impact globally, but the carrot is with business as usual, with normal, natural, continuous, same policies, we won't unlock this door. We need to keep on trying and accept that even the best sophisticated, the best CBAM will not unlock the door, but it will give us some inputs and some feedback to understand that it is possible as long as we think hard about these two elements of the trilemma. And I leave it there.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Maximo, for this wonderful conversation. You're absolutely right. There are many different ways you peel the onion, and CBAM is one of the ways. And there are obviously many different avenues to achieve the energy transition in a cost-effective manner and unlocking the energy trilemma. So hopefully we will discover more in the months and the years to come. And with that, I'd like to thank Jose and Maximo for this wonderful podcast. Thank you very much, and look forward to the next one. Thank you.
Thank you both.
We hope you liked this conversation. Follow us on LinkedIn or subscribe for free to the podcast on the platform of your choice, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, or Apple. Because in the next episode, Ravi and Jam will speak with another expert in the industry to unlock the energy trilemma.